It began in the frozen silence of the Arctic in the summer of 1942, a route so deadly it was known among sailors as the Murmansk-Run. From a naval base at Valfjord, Iceland, 35 merchant ships formed up in a long gray line, their hulls heavy with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies destined for the Soviet front. This was Convoy PQ-17, a lifeline between Britain and Stalin's besieged armies. Its mission was vital. Its dangers were unspeakable. The men aboard knew the odds. Arctic convoys had already earned a grim reputation, torpedoed by U-boats, bombed by the Luftwaffe, and frozen solid by the unrelenting cold. Temperatures could drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the sea itself could kill a man in less than a minute. Yet, on June 27, 1942, they sailed anyway, escorted by a formidable force of British and American warships. The heavy cruisers HMS London and USS Wichita, destroyers like HMS Onslow and HMS Offa, and corvettes, minesweepers, and armed trawlers. Together, they represented a rare unity of Allied resolve, steaming into one of the most hostile theaters of the war. The voyage began under an uneasy calm. Fog rolled low over the Arctic waters as the convoy made its slow progress northeast. Ice fields threatened from the north, German-occupied Norway from the south. Above them, long days and sleepless nights blurred into a pale twilight that never truly ended. Radio silence was ordered. No smoking on deck. Every man knew that somewhere, out of sight, the German battleship Tirpitz lay waiting, the beast of the north, capable of annihilating the entire convoy. On the HMS Keppel, Captain Jack Broom watched the horizon through his binoculars. A career sailor, practical and cool-headed, Broom was not a man given to panic. But the tension was unmistakable. "It's not the sea I fear," one sailor wrote in his diary, "but the silence, the idea that they're watching us, that death is already charting our course." That entry would later be found in a waterlogged notebook, recovered weeks after the disaster. By the third day, reconnaissance planes appeared on the horizon. High, distant shapes marked with the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. The escort ships scrambled into position, guns elevated, ready for the first attack run. Yet the planes did not strike. They simply circled, observed, and vanished back into the mist. The Germans were tracking them, measuring their movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. The convoy pressed on. Messages from the Admiralty in London were sparse and coded, relayed through frigid static that often broke apart mid-transmission. On board, crews fought the monotony with coffee and cigarettes, chipping ice from the decks to keep the ships from toppling under its weight. Each day brought a new crisis: ice damage, mechanical failure, or the ever-present threat of submarines. The merchantmen, slow and heavily laden, could make barely 8 knots. Every mile was an eternity. Yet morale held, bolstered by the presence of the American warships and the shared purpose that bound the Allied crews together. "If these supplies reach Russia," one Royal Navy officer noted, "they could turn the tide at Stalingrad." That hope alone was enough to push them onward through the gray desolation. Then came the first shadow of doubt. British intelligence, known as Ultra, had intercepted new German communications suggesting that the Tirpitz and several destroyers had left their Norwegian fjord. The implication was clear: the convoy was being hunted. In London, First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound faced an impossible choice. The losses of earlier Arctic convoys had been staggering, and the political cost of losing PQ-17 could be devastating. Unverified reports hinted that the Tirpitz might already be steaming toward the Barents Sea. But on the ships themselves, no one knew this yet. They only knew that air attacks were growing more frequent, and that German U-boats were drawing closer. The sound of distant explosions carried across the water, muffled but unmistakable. By July 3rd, Broom's men were exhausted, the constant alert and sub-zero winds wearing them down. In the wardroom of HMS Keppel, Broom pored over his charts, tracing the convoy's slow progress eastward. "If we make it past Novaya Zemlya," he told his navigator, "we might just be safe." But fate, and a single coded message from London, would soon change everything. That night, the Admiralty transmitted an urgent order: convoy to scatter. The escorts were to withdraw westward to engage a phantom threat, the Tirpitz, while the unarmed merchant ships were left to proceed alone, each for itself, across hundreds of miles of hostile ocean. Broom read the signal twice, scarcely believing it. The convoy's protection was being stripped away, its fate placed entirely in its own hands. "We were ordered," he would later write, "to abandon the very ships we swore to protect." As the escorts turned away, the merchant captains watched in silence, engines rumbling in the frozen dark. Somewhere beyond the fog, German submarines were already listening. The convoy was now alone in the Arctic, a fleet without protection, without direction, and soon, without hope. Next time, in Chapter 2, The Order to Scatter, we uncover how a single decision from London became one of the most tragic mistakes in naval history. At 21:11 on July 4th, 1942, a message crackled across the Arctic airwaves: convoys to scatter. Those 5 words, brief, official, unquestionable, shattered what little cohesion remained in Convoy PQ-17. To the merchant captains who received it, the order was nearly incomprehensible. Scatter? In submarine-infested waters, without escort? But the message carried the Admiralty's seal, and in war, orders were to be obeyed, not questioned. Captain Jack Broom aboard HMS Keppel was stunned. For days he had maneuvered his escorts, British destroyers and corvettes, American cruisers USS Wichita and USS Tuscaloosa, to shield the vulnerable merchantmen. Now, with one transmission, that shield was gone. It was like telling a flock of sheep to run from the wolves, he later wrote. Only the wolves were faster, hungrier, and could smell fear in the water. The order had come from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord himself. In London's underground war room, intelligence analysts pored over decrypt for Bletchley Park. One of them suggested that the German battleship Tirpitz, accompanied by Admiral Scheer and several destroyers, had left its base in Altenfjord, Norway. To Pound, the danger was immediate and absolute. A single shell from Tirpitz's 15-inch guns could destroy any convoy ship in seconds. The memory of the Bismarck's rampage the year before haunted him. If Tirpitz broke through, PQ-17 could be annihilated, and the Royal Navy humiliated. So he acted, based on partial information. He ordered the heavy escorts to withdraw west to meet the supposed threat, leaving the unarmed convoy to continue east alone. No one in the war room knew that Tirpitz remained at anchor, never having left the fjord. Out on the freezing Barents Sea, the order's consequences were immediate. Merchant ships like the SS River Afton, SS Navarino, and SS William Hooper broke formation, veering off into the gray wilderness of the Arctic Ocean. Some captains headed north, hoping to slip past the enemy under cover of fog. Others turned south toward the coast of Novaya Zemlya, seeking shelter among the ice floes. Many simply wandered east, trusting luck more than logic. The escort's departure was a scene of disbelief. As HMS Keppel and her sister ships pulled away, sailors stood silently at the rails, watching the convoy drift apart behind them. One American officer aboard USS Wichita wrote, "We left them to die, and every man aboard knew it." That line, later censored in official reports, reflected the moral weight of the moment. Within hours, the wolves descended. German U-boats, shadowing the convoy for days, pounced on the scattered ships. U-88 torpedoed SS Carleton, while SS Navarino was struck and sank in minutes, her cargo of aircraft and tanks vanishing beneath the waves. Survivors huddled in lifeboats as oil burned across the surface of the sea. Above them, the distant drone of aircraft heralded a new wave of terror. The Luftwaffe's KG-26 and KG-30 squadrons, flying Heinkel He-111s and Ju-88s from northern Norway, found the scattered ships easy prey. Bombs fell through the mist with deadly accuracy. One merchantman, SS Washington, was hit amidships and exploded, sending fragments of steel raining down on the nearby SS River Afton. The Arctic sky glowed orange that night, a fire burning on an ocean of ice. Amid the chaos, radio operators sent desperate distress signals, but few reached London. The ionosphere was unstable, communications unreliable. For most of that terrible night, The scattered crews were alone in both sea and sound. It was as if the world had vanished, recalled one survivor. There was only the sea, the cold, and the waiting. Back in London, news of the attacks trickled in slowly. Fragmented reports, lost signals, coordinates that made no sense. Pound, realizing the magnitude of what had been unleashed, could only wait. The Admiralty had acted on fear, and now the Arctic was claiming its price. Among those who later studied the disaster, historian Stephen Roskill would write, PQ-17 was not lost by enemy action, but by the paralysis of command. The moral is timeless. In war, panic disguised as prudence can be more fatal than the enemy itself. As dawn broke on July 5th, the Arctic was strewn with burning wreckage and drifting lifeboats. Of the 35 merchant ships that had set out, many were now gone, swallowed by the sea or sunk beneath German bombs. And yet, amidst the devastation, a few ships pressed on, refusing to surrender to despair. They still carried their secret cargo, and with it, a shadow that would linger for decades, a mystery about what, exactly, Convoy PQ-17 had been ordered to protect. Next time, in Chapter 3, the hunters and the hunted, the German wolf packs close in, and the Arctic turns from battlefield to graveyard. By dawn on July 5th, 1942, the Barents Sea had become a graveyard of ice and fire. The once mighty Convoy PQ-17 was now a scattering of isolated ships, drifting in the gray mist, each one alone, each one hunted. For the German Navy, the chase was on. For the Allied sailors, survival had become the only mission. The Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine moved with ruthless coordination. From bases in Kirkens and Banach, squadrons of Heinkel He-111s and Junkers Ju-88s took off in relentless waves, guided by reconnaissance aircraft that had stalked the convoy for days. Below the surface, Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat wolf packs, U-88, U-334, U-255, and others, were closing in from every direction. The Arctic, vast and empty, was now a killing zone. The merchant ship SS Bolton Castle was among the first spotted. Her crew fought valiantly, manning anti-aircraft guns as dive bombers swooped low, their engines howling through the fog. A single 500 kilograms bomb struck her aft deck, detonating the ammunition hold. Survivors later described the blast as a sunrise that lasted only a second. The ship vanished in flames, leaving only wreckage and a slick of burning oil. Nearby, the SS River Afton, carrying aircraft components and radar parts for the Soviet front, was caught by U-334. 2 torpedoes hit her midsection. The crew abandoned ship in lifeboats, but the freezing water was merciless. The sea was alive, one survivor recalled, but not with men, for they froze before they could even cry out. The Arctic took more lives than any enemy weapon could. Captain Jack Broom, now far to the west aboard HMS Keppel, could only listen to the Mayday calls breaking across his wireless, each one fainter than the last. Merchantmen attacked, position unknown, survivors in water. The static between signals was as haunting as the voices themselves. Broom later wrote, "I heard courage dissolve into silence that day." For the Germans, PQ-17 was a triumph of intelligence and patience. Admiral Donitz's headquarters intercepted Allied transmissions and tracked the drifting remnants of the convoy. U-boat commanders sent terse radio reports, sinkings confirmed. No surface escort sighted. Even the Luftwaffe crews were astonished at how defenseless the ships were. One German pilot, years later, admitted, "It was like target practice. We could not understand why they had no protection." Among the chaos, a few ships attempted desperate measures. The SS Silver Sword steamed north into the drifting ice, hoping to hide among the floes. The SS Samuel Chase, an American Liberty ship, shut down her engines and coated her deck in soot to blend with the ice fog. For days, she drifted undetected, her crew silent, frostbitten, and terrified. When rescued weeks later, her logbook simply read, "Alive, alone, Arctic." By July 7th, less than half of the convoy remained afloat. Of those, most were damaged or adrift. The Royal Navy escorts, now aware that Tirpitz had not moved, turned back east, but it was too late. The scattered ships were beyond reach, their coordinates unknown. The Admiralty in London issued terse updates to the press. Contact lost. Enemy action severe. Situation developing. In truth, they already feared the worst. The tragedy of PQ-17 was not just in the loss of ships or cargo, but in the human endurance it demanded. Sailors fought not only the enemy, but the sea itself, the cold, the hunger, the endless isolation. The Arctic is a living enemy, said one survivor. You do not fight it. You survive it, if it allows you to. One mystery, however, began to emerge amid the wreckage. Soviet reconnaissance pilots later reported spotting debris from a ship that appeared intact. Her hold sealed, her superstructure undamaged, drifting far north of the convoy's route. Yet when Soviet vessels arrived days later, nothing was there. No ship, no survivors, no wreckage, just empty ocean. Some speculated that this was one of the ships carrying special cargo, classified radar components, or diplomatic crates intended for Moscow. Others believed it was a navigational error, nothing more. The truth has never been fully confirmed. As the Arctic fog thickened once more, the surviving ships pressed on, small, silent, and half-mad with exhaustion. Out of 35 merchant vessels, only 11 would eventually reach Arkhangelsk. The rest lay beneath the ice, their cargo lost to time and tide. From London to Murmansk, the echoes of PQ-17's destruction rippled through the corridors of power. In the House of Commons, questions were raised. Churchill himself demanded explanations. Yet in the frozen north, no explanation mattered to the men who had lived through it. They knew the cost of one fateful order, and they carried its weight forever. Next time, in Chapter 4, The Order That Should Never Have Been, London discovers the truth behind the phantom threat of the Tirpitz, and the Admiralty faces its darkest reckoning. In London, the corridors of the Admiralty were heavy with silence. By the second week of July 1942, reports from the Arctic were grim beyond belief. Convoy PQ-17, once hailed as a symbol of Allied unity, had been reduced to drifting wreckage. 24 ships lost, thousands of tons of vital war material gone, hundreds of sailors, British, American, and Norwegian, missing or dead. And the most haunting part of all, the German battleship Tirpitz, the monster that had prompted the fateful order to scatter, had never fired a single shot. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound sat alone in the war room beneath Whitehall, surrounded by maps and intercepted signals. The ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, which he had relied upon so heavily, were spread across the table. One report, vague, incomplete, had indicated Tirpitz was moving out of Altenfjord. Yet when the Norwegian resistance later confirmed that she had remained at anchor, Pound realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had ordered his escorts to abandon the convoy based on a phantom threat. Churchill, furious and shaken, wrote in his memoirs, "The loss of PQ-17 was one of the most lamentable naval disasters of the war. The courage of our sailors was unmatched, but courage cannot undo an error of command." In the House of Commons, questions echoed about whether intelligence had been misread or whether the Admiralty had acted out of fear rather than evidence. The public, however, would hear little. The full story of PQ-17 remained classified until after the war. At Bletchley Park, codebreakers analyzed every intercepted German transmission again, searching for the signal that had sparked the alarm. There was none. The Kriegsmarine had indeed prepared Tirpitz for sea, fueling her and moving destroyers to escort, but bad weather and cautious leadership had kept her in port. The British, having decrypted fragments of this preparation, assumed the attack was already underway. One analyst later wrote, "We mistook readiness for action, and action for catastrophe." For the men of the Royal Navy, the psychological toll was immense. Captain Jack Broom, whose escort group had been ordered away, faced accusations that his ships had run from battle. His career and his reputation were both damaged. In his later book Convoy is to Scatter, Broom wrote bitterly, "We obeyed the Admiralty's word as law. It was not cowardice that guided us. It was obedience. The shame was not ours to bear." The U.S. Navy officers who had escorted PQ-17 shared his dismay. Rear Admiral Robert C. Ike Jiffin, commanding the American cruisers USS Wichita and USS Tuscaloosa, recorded his outrage in a private letter. "We were recalled from our duty to guard those ships. Our men stood ready to fight, yet the call came to turn back. It is a wound that will not soon heal." Meanwhile, the Soviets were blunt. Stalin sent a terse message through diplomatic channels. "You sent us ships, then left them to die." The Allies' fragile cooperation strained under the weight of the disaster, even as the Eastern Front cried out for supplies. But behind the anger lay something deeper, a question of what had truly been aboard some of those lost ships. In post-war files, declassified decades later, certain manifests from PQ-17 were found missing or redacted. One entry, marked Confidential Stores, was recorded aboard SS Empire Tide, one of the ships lost without a trace. Historians later speculated that it may have contained advanced radar components or prototype electronic countermeasures equipment bound for Soviet testing, a project so secret it was never officially acknowledged. Others suggested diplomatic cargo, sealed crates of documents and code machines, part of a classified liaison mission to Moscow. If true, that cargo might explain the panic within the Admiralty. Losing it to German hands could have compromised Allied communications across the Arctic theater. Whether Admiral Pound knew this, or acted solely from fear of Tirpitz, remains one of history's unanswered questions. In the years after the war, Admiral Pound's health declined rapidly. He died in 1943, before he could ever publicly defend or explain his decision. His order would haunt naval strategy for decades, a cautionary tale of how incomplete intelligence and rigid hierarchy could doom even the bravest of men. The Arctic convoys continued, but none were ever quite the same. New tactics were adopted: heavier escorts, air cover, and stricter operational control. Yet the shadow of PQ-17 lingered over every subsequent mission. "We learned," wrote one Royal Navy officer, "that fear must never command the fleet." Still, whispers persisted among Arctic sailors and intelligence officers alike. Rumors that certain sealed crates from PQ-17 had been spotted floating weeks later near Novaya Zemlya, then mysteriously disappeared. Soviet recovery teams reportedly sent divers, but their findings were never made public. Whatever had been inside those crates, if they existed at all, was lost to history, buried in ice and secrecy. Next time, in Chapter 5, Ghosts in the Ice, the survivors' testimonies reveal strange discoveries among the wrecks and the lingering mystery of PQ-17's lost cargo. The Arctic Ocean keeps its secrets well. For decades after convoy PQ-17 was lost, the frozen Barents Sea remained an open grave, silent, impenetrable, and merciless. But in the weeks following the disaster, the Soviets began recovery operations. What they found, and what they did not, only deepened the mystery surrounding the ill-fated convoy. By late July 1942, Soviet icebreakers and rescue trawlers began searching along the convoy's intended route toward Arkhangelsk. Among the drifting wreckage, they discovered lifeboats frozen solid, containing the bodies of Allied sailors still clutching ration tins and flare pistols. Some were found in groups, huddled together for warmth that never came. The Soviet crews buried them at sea with full honors. They died as heroes, one Russian captain recorded in his log, facing the Arctic, not surrendering to it. But not all findings could be so easily explained. North of Novaya Zemlya, a reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting a merchant vessel apparently intact, its hull visible through gaps in the ice. The coordinates corresponded roughly to where the SS Empire Tide, one of the convoy's British freighters, was last reported. When a Soviet salvage vessel arrived days later, the ship had vanished. No trace, no debris, no oil slick, just the silent, shifting ice. To some, it was simply the sea claiming another victim. But for others within the Allied intelligence community, the disappearance raised questions. The Empire Tide had been carrying cargo marked as classified stores, sealed under the authority of the British Admiralty. Rumors spread among Arctic sailors that the ship had been carrying something more than munitions. possibly experimental radar technology or diplomatic code machines intended for Soviet liaison officers in Murmansk. If so, the disappearance of a wreck would be more than tragic. It would be suspicious. Survivors from other ships told strange, fragmentary stories. One recalled drifting past what he believed was the hull of the Empire Tide, completely upright, as though frozen in place by the surrounding ice. It looked as if the sea had decided to keep her, he said later. Another claimed to have seen Soviet patrol boats in the same area weeks later, conducting what appeared to be recovery operations. Yet no official Soviet report ever acknowledged such a mission. Meanwhile, the human side of the tragedy began to emerge through testimony and diaries recovered from the dead. One poignant note was found in a sealed tin box aboard a lifeboat from SS River Afton. It read, "Asterisk, to whoever finds this, tell my wife I did my duty. We were scattered and left alone. The ice will take us soon. Do not blame our captains. They obeyed as we all must." Asterisk, it was signed only, Art Lewis, radio officer. His body was never found. As the Soviets cataloged what wrecks they could, Western intelligence officers grew increasingly frustrated. Reports were inconsistent. Some ships, supposedly sunk by air attack, were later found with no visible bomb damage. Others were missing entirely from their last known positions. In one case, a Soviet trawler recovered a sealed crate from an unidentifiable wreck, its stenciled markings crudely removed. The crate was handed to Soviet security officials and never seen again. When the war ended, the British government quietly closed the PQ-17 file. Official statements listed cargo losses in general terms: military supplies, machinery, and vehicles. Classified sections, later declassified in part during the 1970s, included one enigmatic phrase, asterisk, certain items of technical sensitivity presumed unrecoverable. Asterisk, to historians, that suggested radar or code equipment, possibly linked to early Allied experiments with long-range detection systems. For the survivors, however, such mysteries mattered little. They remembered only the fear, the cold, and the abandonment. "We were forgotten," said able seaman Harold Innes, one of the few to reach Arkhangelsk alive. "No one came for us. We were ghosts before we even died." His words, published decades later, captured the enduring bitterness of those who lived when so many did not. Yet the Soviet side of the story remained largely untold. In the archives of Murmansk, closed until after the Cold War, Soviet naval reports described unidentified wrecks and sealed containers recovered for examination. Some divers claimed they found ships with British markings far from the convoy's original course, as if towed or carried by drifting ice. None of those logs were ever publicly verified. In 1982, a joint British-Soviet expedition returned to the Barents to search for PQ-17's remains. They found twisted steel and shattered hulls resting on the seabed, silent reminders of the convoy's fate. But the Empire Tide and the supposed classified cargo were nowhere to be found. What exactly went down with PQ-17 that summer? Ordinary cargo, or something far more secret, remains an open question. Some mysteries, it seems, are frozen too deep for history to thaw. Next time, in Chapter 6, The Legacy Beneath the Ice, divers and historians return to the Arctic decades later to uncover the truth behind PQ-17's final resting place and the haunting questions that still remain. The Arctic keeps its dead and its secrets. Nearly half a century after the destruction of Convoy PQ-17, the frozen Barents Sea drew explorers, divers, and historians back to its depths. What began as a mission of remembrance soon turned into something more, a search for answers about one of World War II's most haunting mysteries. In the late 1980s, joint British and Soviet expeditions began scanning the seabed north of Novaya Zemlya using sidescan sonar. The cold, still waters had preserved much of the wreckage. They found ships lying upright, their hulls intact but silent, the masts draped with ghostly seaweed. The names on the bows, *Navarino*, River Afton, Washington, were faint but legible. It was as if time had simply stopped the moment the bombs fell. When the divers descended into the wrecks, they found haunting relics, personal letters sealed in tins, uniforms folded in lockers, half-eaten rations still frozen in mess halls. One diver, a former Soviet naval officer, later said, "It felt like stepping into a room where everyone had just left." But amid the echoes of tragedy, they discovered anomalies, sealed compartments and storage holds that didn't appear on the official cargo manifests. In one wreck, believed to be the SS Empire Tide, the divers located a section of the hold welded shut. Inside, beneath layers of ice, they found metal containers marked only with British military serials. No cargo descriptions, no documentation. The containers were retrieved under Soviet supervision and flown to Murmansk for examination. When British officials inquired about the recovery, the Soviet response was terse. No items of military significance recovered. The containers were never mentioned again. Some of the expedition crew, years later, broke their silence. One claimed the crates were stamped with the initials ADM-R/T, a code sometimes used for Admiralty research and telecommunications. If true, that suggested the cargo could have been part of an early radar or signal intelligence system, perhaps even components of the top-secret H-2S radar then under development. It was technology Britain guarded jealously. Yet PQ-17 had been meant to share such advances with the Soviet Union as part of wartime cooperation. Whether the shipment was real or myth remains unproven. British naval historian Richard Woodman later wrote, "PQ-17 is not just a story of loss. It is a study in fear, how fear at the highest level of command can sink more ships than enemy guns. The legacy of the Convoy," he argued, "lies in how the Royal Navy learned from it. Never again would an order be given without full intelligence confirmation, and never again would a convoy be abandoned to its fate. For the men who survived, the memories never faded." In 1992, the 50th anniversary of PQ-17, a memorial service was held at Scapa Flow. Veterans gathered under gray northern skies to honor the fallen. Some came in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes, but all carried the same haunted look. A survivor named Bill Metcalf, once a gunner aboard the SS Daniel Morgan, spoke simply, "We were told to scatter, and the sea did the rest." The crowd fell silent. Today, wrecks from PQ-17 still lie scattered across the Arctic floor, a steel trail stretching hundreds of miles. Each one tells a fragment of a larger story, of courage, confusion, and sacrifice. Even with modern sonar, several ships remain unfound. Among them, the Empire Tide continues to elude discovery, her coordinates lost to time. Some divers claim shifting ice or sediment may have buried her forever. Others believe she lies in a trench too deep for exploration. And so the mystery endures. Was PQ-17's loss simply a product of flawed intelligence? Or did its destruction conceal something more? An effort to protect secrets too valuable to risk capture? Historians debate, governments deny, and the Arctic keeps its silence. What is certain is this: the story of PQ-17 is not just about the ships that sank, but about the human decisions that doomed them. It is a reminder that even in war, the greatest dangers are often not the enemy's guns, but our own fears. As the cold currents sweep across the wrecks, the rusted decks whisper their testimony into the deep. Somewhere beneath the ice, the unanswered questions of 1942 remain, sealed in steel, waiting for history to finally listen. 6 chapters finished, waiting for prompt 3.